The department meeting started 7 minutes late, the way it always did. I sat in my usual spot near the back, notebook open, pen ready. My manager, Derek Hollis, stood at the front of the room with that easy smile he wore like armor, the one that made people trust him before he'd even opened his mouth. "Before we dive into updates," he said, adjusting his tie, "I have some exciting news." The room leaned in. I leaned in too because I already knew what was coming. HR had confirmed it 2 weeks ago. The senior operations director role. Derek cleared his throat, let the silence stretch just a beat too long, and smiled wider. "I'm thrilled to announce that I've been promoted to senior operations director, effective immediately." The applause started before I could process what I'd just heard. Someone near me whispered, "That's great news." My pen stopped moving. My hand was steady, but something cold and sharp settled in my chest. Not shock, clarity. People clap. A few of them turned to me with polite smiles, the kind you give someone at a funeral. Derek's assistant, a young woman named Petra, leaned over and squeezed my shoulder. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. Around the room I watched people react. Some looked genuinely happy for Derek. Others exchanged quick glances, the kind that told me they already knew. They'd known before today. Before this meeting. Maybe before I ever walked into the room. Someone I barely knew patted my back as they passed my chair afterward, murmuring something about how these things happen. As if a promotion was a weather event. Something random. Something nobody caused. I closed my notebook slowly, tucking my pen into the spiral binding. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. Thought they would be. As the room emptied, Derek caught my eye from across the space. He didn't look away. He smiled, small, quiet, almost private. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't guilt. It was the smile of someone who had just finished a job he'd planned carefully, and he knew it had gone exactly the way he wanted. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He didn't flinch. Then he turned back to shake hands with someone from finance, already moving on, already celebrating. I watched him for a moment longer. The way he laughed, the way he leaned in when people talked, the way everyone gravitated toward him like he was the center of something warm. He was good at that. He'd always been good at that. But standing there, watching him work the room, I understood something I hadn't fully seen before. He planned this. Not today. Not this week. This had been weeks in the making, maybe longer. I walked out of the conference room and down the long hallway toward my office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. My footsteps were quiet against the carpet. I pushed open my door, sat down, and stared at my desk for a full minute without moving. Then I said it out loud just to hear it. "My name is Ruth Callahan. And that was my promotion." The words felt solid. Real. Not angry, just true. I'd spent 2 years working toward that role. 2 years of staying late, of fixing problems nobody else wanted to touch, of building systems that made the entire department run smoother. HR had told me in writing that I was the front runner. They'd used the word confirmed. And now Derek Hollis was wearing the title like it had always belonged to him. I pulled up my email and stared at the message from HR, dated 14 days ago. "We are pleased to confirm your candidacy for the Senior Operations Director position." I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. Something had just shifted inside me. Something quiet. And something dangerous. 3 months earlier everything had seemed fine. Better than fine, actually. I'd been called into a meeting with HR, just a routine check-in, they said. But halfway through the tone changed. Sandra from HR smiled and pulled up a folder. "Ruth, we wanted to let you know that your application for Senior Operations Director is looking very strong." She slid a printed summary across the table. "Barring any unexpected changes, you can expect a formal offer within the next 4 to 6 weeks." I remembered the feeling. Not excitement exactly, but something quieter. Relief. Validation. I'd earned this. Every late night, every problem I'd solved without being asked, every time I'd stayed when others left, it had all been building toward this moment. Sandra shook my hand at the end. "You've done exceptional work," she said. "The department wouldn't function the way it does without you." I thanked her and walked back to my desk feeling, for the first time in a long while, like the ground beneath me was solid. The truth was, I'd built half of what Derek now claimed as his own. The training manuals that onboard every new hire. I wrote those. The workflow system that cut our project turnaround time by 30%. That was mine. The client communication templates that kept our biggest accounts happy during 2 separate crises. Also mine. Derek never wrote a single one of them. What he did was take them, polish the language slightly, and present them in meetings as the output of his vision. And nobody questioned it. Why would they? He was charming. He was confident. He stood at the front of the room and spoke with the kind of authority that made people stop thinking and start agreeing. I was the one in the background making sure the machine actually worked. And I was fine with that for a while. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, as long as the work got done. I told myself patience was a virtue. I was wrong. Looking back, I could see the pattern stretching all the way to my first month on the team. Small things at first. An idea I mentioned in a group chat, only to hear Derek present it in a meeting the next day as if it had just come to him. A report I drafted overnight, which showed up in his weekly summary with his name at the top and mine nowhere to be found. A process improvement I pitched to him privately, which he rolled out to the department as his own initiative. Each time I told myself it was an accident, a miscommunication. He was busy. He probably forgot. But the pattern never stopped. It just got quieter, smoother, harder to point to without sounding bitter or petty. And so I stayed quiet, kept working, kept building. And I kept, without fully realizing it, keeping records. After the meeting where Derek took my promotion, I made a decision. I would not confront him. I would not march into his office and demand an explanation. I would not send an angry email or escalate to HR in a panic. Every instinct in my body told me to fight, to stand up, to make noise, to force someone to see what had happened. But I'd watched enough people do that to know where it usually ended. You look emotional. You look difficult. You look like someone who can't handle disappointment. So instead I did something harder. I said nothing. I went back to my desk the next morning and I did my job. I answered emails. I fixed a scheduling conflict that had been dragging on for a week. I helped a junior analyst finish a report she was stuck on. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. And I watched. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. Within the first week of Derek's new title, he had to lead a strategy meeting that I'd always quietly prepped him for beforehand. Without my notes, without my bullet points, without the summary I used to leave on his desk the night before. He was lost. I sat in the back of the room and watched him stumble. He started a sentence about quarterly projections and couldn't finish it. He fumbled with a slide deck that someone else had put together without my input, because they didn't know the format I always used. 2 people in the room exchanged looks. Derek recovered. He always recovered. But the confidence in the room had shifted. For the first time, people were watching him more carefully. And I was watching them watch him. By the end of the second week, the first deadline slipped. It was a client deliverable, a proposal that was supposed to go out on a Friday. Derek had assured the client it would be ready. But the internal deadline had been set based on a workflow I'd built. And without me quietly managing the timeline behind the scenes, nobody caught the delay until it was too late. A client called. Derek handled it with his usual charm, promising a revised timeline and a personal apology. But when the call ended, I watched him close his office door a little too hard. That evening, I heard from Petra that 2 people on the leadership team had asked the same question separately to different colleagues. Who used to handle this? Nobody had a good answer. Or rather, everyone had the same answer. They just hadn't said it out loud yet. That weekend, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. I navigated to my work email, the archive I kept synced to a personal folder the way I always had. Timestamps, subject lines, drafts I'd saved before sending, versions of documents with my edits tracked and dated. I'd never thought of it as building a case. It was just how I worked. Organized, careful. professional. But sitting there, scrolling through months of emails, I began to see the full shape of what I had. Every idea I'd contributed. Every document I'd created. Every message where I'd sent Derek a draft and he'd replied with a simple, "Great, I'll use this." Every time I'd done the work that ended up under his name. It was all there. Clean. Undeniable. Timestamps don't lie. And I had hundreds of them. On Tuesday of the third week, I was in the kitchen getting coffee when Marcus Hale appeared beside me. Marcus was a senior manager 2 levels above Derek. Quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who listened more than he talked. He poured his own coffee and stood next to me for a moment without saying anything. Then casually, like he was commenting on the weather, he said, "Ruth, I've been meaning to ask you something. Off the record." I turned to him, keeping my expression open. "Of course." He glanced toward the hallway to make sure no one was nearby. "Some of the project timelines from last quarter, the ones that ran so smoothly, I've been looking at the logs. Your name comes up a lot more than I expected." He paused. "I just wanted to understand the process better." I told him what I could, carefully without pointing fingers. But I saw something change in his expression as I talked. A quiet kind of attention that hadn't been there before. Derek was good at deflection. That was one of the things that made him so effective in meetings. He could take a problem, reframe it, and make it sound like nobody's fault. Team misalignment, he called it during a Thursday check-in, when someone asked why 2 projects had fallen behind. "We're in a transition period. These things take time." The people in the room nodded. Course they did. Derek had a way of making excuses sound like wisdom. But I noticed something. The nods were slower this time. A couple of people glanced at each other before they responded. The trust, that invisible thing that held a team together, had started to thin. I said nothing during that meeting. I didn't need to. Lies need volume to survive. They need to be repeated, defended, reinforced. The truth doesn't. Just needs to exist. I spent 3 evenings writing the email. The first draft was too long. Pages of detail, every grievance laid out in order. I deleted it. The second draft was too short, just a few lines that could be dismissed as vague. I deleted that too. The third draft was different. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't use words like stolen or unfair. I simply laid out a factual summary of the project handoffs from the last quarter. Who had initiated what, who had drafted what, and when. I attached the relevant emails and documents as files. I addressed it to Marcus because he'd asked. The tone was professional, measured, almost boring if you read it on the surface. But underneath it was precise. Every sentence was a thread, and if you pulled any one of them, the whole picture would unravel. I read it one more time, slowly, checking each fact against my records. Everything matched. I saved it as a draft and closed my laptop. I wasn't ready to send it yet. Not tonight. I sent the email on a Wednesday morning at 8:47 a.m., right before I walked into a routine team sync. I didn't hesitate. I didn't reread it one final time. I simply opened the draft, checked the recipient field, Marcus Hale, senior manager, and pressed send. Then I closed my laptop, picked up my coffee, and walked to the conference room like any other morning. The email was neutral, factual. I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I had simply answered the question Marcus had asked me in the kitchen 2 weeks earlier. Who did the work, and when? The attachments spoke for themselves. 14 emails with timestamps. 3 document drafts with version histories. 2 project timelines that showed, clearly and without interpretation, exactly how the work had moved from my hands to Derek's name. I hadn't needed to say a single accusatory word. By Thursday afternoon, the email had moved. I found out later, from Petra, who heard it from someone in finance, that Marcus had forwarded it. Not to Derek. Not to HR. To 2 other senior leaders, including the VP of Operations, whose name was on every major decision the department had made for the past year. I hadn't asked Marcus to do that. I hadn't expected it. The email had been meant as an answer to a question, nothing more. But once it was in the hands of people with authority, It was no longer just my story. It was a document, evidence. And documents, once they exist, have a way of finding the people who need to read them. I went home that evening feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Lighter. Not because I knew what would happen next, but because the truth was finally out of my hands. Friday was strange. The office felt different. Not louder or more tense, but quieter. Quieter in a way that felt deliberate. Derek had 2 meetings on his calendar that morning. By noon, both had disappeared. I checked the shared calendar 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. They were gone. No rescheduled times. No explanations. Just blank spaces where meetings used to be. Petra noticed it too. She came by my desk around lunch, her expression careful. "Have you talked to anyone today?" she asked. I shook my head. "Nobody's said anything to me," I said. She nodded slowly, like that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Me neither," she said. Then she looked at me, really looked, and said very quietly, "Something's happening, Ruth." I knew she was right. The following Monday, an email went out from the VP of Operations to the entire department. It was short and formal. An internal review had been initiated, covering project ownership, credit attribution, and workflow documentation across the last 2 quarters. All team members were asked to preserve their emails and files. Ruth Callahan had been asked to participate in the review as a key contributor. I read my name in that sentence 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to feel what it meant. For the first time in 2 years, someone above Derek had looked at the work, the actual work, and seen who had done it. The review wasn't about me. It was about the department, the processes, the way credit had been assigned and decisions had been made. But my name was there. In print. Connected to the truth. The review took 2 weeks. During that time I was interviewed twice. Once by a woman from internal compliance named Audrey, and once by Marcus himself. They asked careful, specific questions. Not, "Did Derek steal your work?" But, "Can you walk us through the origin of this document? And who initiated this project and when?" I answered every question with facts. Emails. File names. I brought nothing emotional into the room. I didn't need to. Halfway through the second interview, Audrey paused and looked up from her notes. "Ruth," she said, "this isn't just about one promotion, is it?" I met her eyes. "No," I said. "It isn't." And that was when I learned that I wasn't the only person on the team whose contributions had been quietly absorbed into Derek's record. 2 other employees had come forward during the review, each with their own documentation, their own timelines, their own stories. The pattern I'd seen wasn't a pattern of one. It was a system. Derek was removed from his position on a Thursday morning. No announcement was made to the department. Not immediately. But word spread the way it always does in an office. Through whispers, through closed doors, through the way people's eyes moved when someone's name came up. Petra told me at 10 a.m. She appeared at my desk with 2 cups of coffee, handed me one and sat down. "He's out," she said simply. "Pending review." He nodded. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated exactly, though maybe that word was close. What I felt was tired. Tired in the way you feel after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. The department didn't freeze. Not completely. But there was a stillness in the hallways that afternoon. The kind that comes when people are reassessing everything they thought they knew about someone they trusted. 2 days after Derek's removal, I received a meeting invitation from Sandra in HR, the same woman who had confirmed my promotion months earlier. I walked into her office expecting awkwardness. Instead, she smiled, a real smile, not a corporate one, and closed the door. "Ruth, I owe you an apology," she said. "The process broke down in a way it shouldn't have. We should have caught this sooner." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a formal offer letter. Senior Operations Director. The role that had been mine all along. I read it slowly, carefully. Title was right. The salary was right. Everything on the page was exactly what had been promised to me months ago. I looked up at Sandra. "I appreciate this," I said. And I meant it. But I didn't say yes. Not yet. I asked Sandra for 24 hours to think. She agreed without hesitation. That evening I sat on my couch with a notebook and wrote down 2 columns. What the role meant and what I actually wanted. The promotion had been the goal for 2 years. But sitting there with the dust settling, I realized the goal had shifted. I didn't want to go back to the same department. Not the same room, not the same hallways, not the same dynamic. Even with Derek gone. I wanted something different. Real authority. A team that hadn't been built on someone else's shadow. The next morning I called Sandra back. I'd like to talk about a different option, I said. A different team. A role with the same level of responsibility, but in a department where I can build something from scratch. There was a pause on the other end. Then Sandra laughed. Quietly, warmly. I think we can do that. My last day in the department was a Friday. I packed my desk in under an hour. There wasn't much to pack. Few photos. A mug Petra had given me for my birthday. A notebook filled with ideas I'd never shared out loud. People came by throughout the day to say goodbye. Some of them said things I hadn't expected. I always knew you were the one holding this together, one of the junior analysts told me, her voice a little unsteady. I just didn't know how to say it. Petra hugged me at the elevator. Don't disappear, she said. I promised I wouldn't. As I walked out of the building that afternoon, I didn't look back. Not because I was angry or bitter, but because looking back felt like something that belonged to a version of myself I'd already outgrown. The woman who walked out that door was quieter than the one who had walked in 2 years earlier. But she was also finally free. My first week in the new department felt like breathing after holding my breath for a long time. The team was smaller, 8 people, all sharp, all curious. My new manager, a woman named Elaine Frost, ran meetings the way I'd always wished meetings were run, with questions instead of speeches, with space for people to think before they spoke. On my second day, Elaine pulled me aside after lunch. I've heard about what happened in your last department, she said, watching my face carefully. I want you to know, here your work will have your name on it. Always. It was such a simple thing to say. But nobody had said it to me in 2 years. I thanked her and went back to my desk. And for the first time in a long time, I opened my laptop and felt genuinely excited about what I was about to do. Within 2 weeks, I'd already restructured 2 workflows and identified a bottleneck that had been slowing the team down for months. People noticed. And this time when they did, my name was attached. 6 months later I sat in my office. A real office with a window and a door that closed, reviewing a project plan I'd built from the ground up. The team had just closed its biggest contract of the year. Elaine had sent me a note that morning. This is exactly the kind of leadership we needed. Thank you. I thought about Ruth Callahan, the version of me who had sat in that department meeting and watched someone else take what was hers. I thought about the email I'd sent, the one that hadn't accused anyone, the one that had simply told the truth. I thought about Derek, whose name I hadn't heard in weeks. And I thought about the quiet, patient decision I'd made that day. Not to fight loudly, but to let the facts do the fighting for me. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't the one that makes the most noise. It's the one that simply refuses to disappear. I closed my laptop, picked up my coffee and looked out the window. The sky was clear. The day was mine. And for the first time in a very long while, so was everything in it.